Okay, just waiting for this to start up so that I can mute this. I'm getting better at these live streams. And they're a lot of fun. So we're going to get into this. I just first have to mute my computer so I don't hear myself. Okay, so welcome back. My name's Kevin Yor, if you don't know me. And I'd like to welcome you to this channel. What I really do here is I talk about music theory and ear training. I do place a heavy composer emphasis on a lot of what I do, but that's not the only thing that I do. So a lot of these courses and ear training programs are really applicable to anybody that wants to get better at music. And so I think it's really important to provide free resources as much as I can to educate everybody that wants to learn and to bring everybody up to a higher level, because the more educated you have a musical audience, the better your audience is going to be. I mean, I think that when we can teach people to hear deeply into music and hear things that maybe others without the right training maybe you wouldn't be able to develop, then I think we get better audiences and people that understand our music more. These live streams are kind of fun for me. They're also a little bit dangerous because they are not scripted. I generally just have a goal in mind, a topic that maybe I want to talk about, and then sometimes I go on these tangents. So I find this to be somewhat refreshing because my years teaching the university, one of the things I liked was I got so good at teaching that I could just have a goal in mind. So I knew that, okay, I had to teach secondary dominance today, and I didn't really have a set lesson plan, although I had plenty of materials at my disposal that I could use to illustrate certain concepts. And I was able to just kind of focus on goals and paying attention to the class rather than I have 10 minutes to talk about this subject, 5 minutes to do a little ear training. So when I find that when you regiment things in a classroom type setting, then you don't pay attention to the class. You're not able to read the room as well. So if you have an overall arc and you know what you have to teach by the end of the semester, what you have to teach by midterms, what you have to teach on a weekly and then a daily basis, I find that works really well. But what I wanted to talk about today, other than my interest in live streaming these days, is really a concept about curiosity and growth. So I'll talk a little bit about my own growth, where I came from as a composer and how I eventually got into teaching music theory and ear training. And I also want to try and talk about how these perspectives can evolve and what this means for you. So when I was younger, I'm going to not go too far back, but I'm going to talk about some of my college days. I had a little bit of a refusal to learn. Now, I was a euphonium player. When I started out, going back a little further, junior high school, I started on the trumpet. And then, actually, that was middle school. I started on the trumpet before middle school. It was like sixth grade, I believe, maybe fifth grade. I started on the trumpet and I really enjoyed the trumpet. But when I got into middle school, my band director convinced me to play the tuba. And so I said, okay, tuba should be fun. It's a challenge. I'll try it out, see if I like it. So I did end up liking it. But then when I got into high school, I said, you know what? I don't really like the tuba. I want to go back to the trumpet. And so what I did, because I was playing bass clef and I didn't know the notes for the treble clef, I said, you know what? I'm going to play euphonium. Euphonium is kind of a small tuba. It's got a real soft kind of euphonious sound. It's kind of like a French horn without the edge and maybe a little bit more rounded sound as well. And it's kind of in between, in my opinion at the time, a tuba and a trumpet because it could play in both the treble and the bass clef. So I decided I was going to play treble clef euphonium to learn the fingerings for the trumpet because the fingerings would have been the same. And then after maybe a semester or a year, I could transfer over to trumpet because, I was in the top wind ensemble my freshman year and I didn't want to switch instruments because I wasn't sure I could maintain that status. So I discovered that I really ended up loving the euphonium, and I stuck with it. And I still play it to this day. Currently, I'm playing with Las Vegas Brass Band. I play baritone, which is an even smaller euphonium. It's conical. There's some particular differences about it, but I just kind of enjoy playing. But when I got into college, and when I learned euphonium, I never really wanted to read any books about it because we didn't really have the internet the way we have it now. And I didn't really want to learn from other players. I always just kind of wanted to do it on my own. And even in college, I was constantly creating these ear training and music theory programs to try and make myself better. But I never wanted to just study a Beethoven sonata when I was younger. I didn't want to learn from Mozart. I thought, what was the point? I thought that I could just sort of improve my compositions without going outside what I was interested in. And I did enjoy certain composers like Gustav Mahler. I really enjoyed his symphonies because I felt they really resonated with the type of music I wanted to write. So there were some composers I would study, but I didn't really know how to study them because I never studied music theory. And so in college, being forced to study music theory, I remember one time I was in a composition seminar and I showed my composition instructor, Virko Bali, the book that I was using because he wanted to see what theory book we were using. And it was a Koska Payne book. And so he took my book and he threw it in the trash can and he said, "You don't need this." And I didn't really understand at the time why he did that. But now I think I understand a little bit better. That particular book, it teaches a lot of analysis, a lot of technique, but it's somewhat removed from actual composition. You learn how to create chord progressions and you memorize all these graphs, and a one chord can go here and so on, but you never actually learn why that works. And without knowing why, then I feel like you're missing a significant portion of the training. And so, he threw my book in the trash and I said, "Okay, but I need that for my theory class. Do you mind if I just dig it?" And I said, "Oh yeah, okay, fine. But don't actually read it." And so that kind of probably wasn't the intention, but reinforced my belief that, you can't really learn from someone else. And so anytime I had a composition lesson, I was very interested in him talking about my compositions and things I could do to develop my ideas. But what I didn't realize, because I didn't have the knowledge, was if I had just studied what Mahler had done, what Mozart had done, what Beethoven had done, what all these other composers had already done, then I would be in a much better position to know techniques that the masters have used, and then to be able to apply them sort of to my own compositions. And then I could potentially develop new techniques. And so it's kind of a weird situation because I started to work on my own little essays on composition and what I was learning from Virko and what I was learning from practice and what I was learning from studying composers like Mahler. But I still just never sat down and just took a theory course to really understand the basics of music theory. So it was later really in my master's program where I started taking music theory very seriously. And once I started learning theory from others, once I started paying attention and learning how music is put together and learning these common trends that we have in music theory, I started to become a much more efficient composer. And what ended up happening was I actually lost interest in composition and I became more interested in the mechanics of music. And I realized at some point that that's all I really cared about was the mechanics of music. But at the time, we're talking 1996, 2000, that's how long ago it was. The internet existed, but it didn't have a lot of resources. I would go to the library and try and find books on music composition. And there were books on musicianship, but they were incomplete, I felt. They were skipping steps. And so this is the point when I really started to create all these programs that you're now seeing on YouTube. I started to create my own training programs for the euphonium, my own training programs for composition, for music history, for music theory. And that's when I started to get really good at creating these programs that work for me. And then later, when I started my composition studio, I use them on my students. And what came of that was, this is actually the third edition. I don't know if you can see this, my Elements in Music Composition. This is my third edition. And what it was meant to be was all the information that I felt a composer needed to get started. Because it's, when you're just starting out as a composer, it's really difficult. What do you need to study? In what order? What things are important? How do you put a composition together? There's all these aspects of music composition that are just scattered throughout the world. You'll find that you have counterpoint, you have music theory, Schenkerian analysis helps, but most people don't study that. You've got ear training, you've got the basic idea of what a motive is and how to develop it. There's all these concepts, and I found that I was learning this stuff kind of on my own. I suppose I could have asked questions about this, but classes back then were very structured, and I didn't really want to, I didn't know where to ask that question. You know, if I asked in kind of a composition seminar, I'd get the answer, well, go take that score and copy it by hand, and you'll learn. And that's true. You will learn by doing that. But I wanted more. I wanted to know what was important. What should I be focusing on? What should I be practicing? And so at a certain point, I realized that there isn't really a book like this out there. So I started to create a book for myself. So the Elements of Music Composition, the very first edition, was released a long time ago. Let's see if I have it in here. The first printing was in 2008. So that would have been right after I finished my master's program. And I had been working on it while I was teaching middle school at this at-risk school with the University of Arizona. It was affiliated with the University of Arizona. It was called Wildcat School. And as I was teaching these kids to compose music, because I was dealing with, you know, 7th and 8th grade at that point, I realized, hey, if these kids can learn to compose music and they know nothing about music, I taught them how to read music, how to write it, and then I showed them how they could develop their ideas. And students were creating compositions by the end of the year. There was something worth teaching in that. And so I started to create this very disorganized semblance of ideas. And I'm talking to you about this so that you understand where all this stuff came from. And I hope it's somewhat motivating, because I need to tell you, this was 2008 where I first got this idea. Now in 2025, I'm putting these courses together that are very logical, very structured, and really try not to miss any steps at all. But I didn't start that way. I started very disorganized, and I just had what was essentially a collection of essays on different topics that I had written about, and they weren't even written very well. I wasn't a great writer when I started. I think if you go and look at my reviews on Amazon, there's one review which I just love. The guy said, "This is waffle." He repeats the same thing over and over again. Now, in my defense, the reason I repeat the same thing over and over again is because that's how I teach. I reinforce concepts and I bring them back. I learned that a little bit from those Pimsleur language programs, where they'll teach you a word and then they'll be very methodical about bringing that word back, just as an example, 10 minutes later, then 20 minutes later, then 30 minutes later, and then 2 days later. So they keep reinforcing old concepts as a way of easily learning, and they call it sort of immersion, right? And so my book in the early days was more of an immersion book. I repeated ideas at key points to try and help you learn these really important basic concepts. Because when it comes down to it, music composition is very basic. There are some basic concepts that allow you to create really effective compositions, but you have to understand how these concepts interrelate to other aspects of music composition, like counterpoint, orchestration, and form, all these different subjects that we talk about independently. And so it started out very scattered, and it started out with all these ideas that I had a lot of trouble organizing into sort of a linear fashion. And that is actually the issue of music composition in general. And Arnold Schoenberg talked about this. he actually created a book, which I've talked about on here before. It's a unified theory of music composition. He tried to create it, he never finished it. And the book talked about counterpoint, music theory, instruction, and form. And I think it dealt a little bit with orchestration as well. And so I studied that book. This is at the point where I'm starting to realize the importance of studying. And I learned a lot from it. And so between that and all these essays I had been creating, and then reading his theory of harmony textbook, and then reading other composers, I had a book, The Musical Idea. And I also had another book, Composers on Music, which was a massive tomb of knowledge. Is basically letters that other composers wrote about composing music. I started to take all this information together, and I kind of turned it into a technique. And that's what Elements of Music Composition was. It was my sort of overview of what I found to be the most important techniques in music composition that composers used. And so I kind of went away from composing music after my master's program, one, because I was burnt out. My master's program kind of did a number on me in terms of just work. And I had a lot of other things going on as well, but I learned to write the music I wanted to write by the end of my master's program, and I didn't really feel a need to write anything else. And so I kind of put it away, partly because I wanted to push into something new. And so I thought, you know what? I'm writing this music. I can hear it in my head. I'm able to notate what I hear accurately. I'm able to create an entire composition really without thinking about a single chord. If you listen to my CD, The Beast of Gévaudan, that's actually my senior recital as an undergraduate. So I was in my 20s, early 20s. And I could not, to this day, tell you a single chord that is in that entire CD. And, you may be able to recognize that when you listen to it. But I published it because I thought it was representative of my development at that time. And it was completely intuitive. So that's an example of where you can go if you're just a very intuitive composer. But I have no idea the chords that are being used in there. I've never bothered to analyze it, and I'm okay with that. But what I have learned is that what happened was, after my master's program, I got tired of that. And so I kind of went on this search to understand music theory better, to understand counterpoint, to understand all these topics that I've been sort of casually taught in the university, but I never really did a deep dive into. And my hope was that what would happen was I could then come back to composition and use these ideas to make my compositions even better. And yes, my compositions are much more sophisticated in a way, but I still don't really have this huge desire to write music. So it kind of backfired in a sense, because I became more of a music theory pedagogue than somebody that truly likes composing music. Now, if somebody asks me to write a piece, I write a piece. And if I have an opportunity to write a piece, I will write music, because it's still fun to write music and put something out there. But I have a different approach now. And so, getting to my point, what I did was I took all of these ideas and I tried to encapsulate them in this tiny little book. This one is 172 pages long, the third edition. And it took a few revisions. If you happen to get the first edition, that is really a collection of essays. And it's not really suitable for reading straight through. You could read each one on its own. And what I tried to do is refresh concepts as I went. The second edition got a little better. When I wrote the third edition, I was pretty happy with it. So the third edition is a good edition, I think, in terms of like trying to express what I want to express. Whether you agree with what I want to express is a wholly different issue, but it's what I wanted to express. But I do pay attention to what people say. And one of the criticisms was that there were no citations. And so I said, you know what? That's fair. And this happened after I've been teaching university for 8 years. So I said, I'm going to go back. I'm going to revisit the Elements of Music Composition, and I'm going to write a new version of it. So that is where we get the fourth edition. It's a little bit thicker. It's also a little bit smaller. So, it takes a little bit off it. But I started to say, this is going to be the last edition I write. I want to make sure that I have referenced everything I can, and I want to go word by word and make sure everything's accurate. So I'm a one-man shop. I do this all by myself. And as far as I could go with my own capabilities, that's what I ended up with, was a fourth edition. So, that's now available on Amazon, but this is probably the last edition of Elements of Music Composition, because it's not meant to be a book that continues to grow. It was really meant to give beginning composers advice on the subjects to study and how they can be integrated. Going back to Arnold Schoenberg's idea of a unified theory of composition, this is sort of my thesis for that. It's how you can integrate counterpoint, orchestration, dynamics, articulations, how all these elements of music composition can come together to create a musical work. And so I was pretty satisfied with that. But my point here is that I learned early on that this refusal to kind of learn the subjects I needed to learn, they really hampered my development. But the thing that I realized I wanted was, I didn't want someone to teach me. I wanted someone to guide me. And I ended up being my own guide in a lot of ways. And yeah, I learned a lot from my professors and composition instructors. I learned from Virko Bali how to be extremely creative and develop an idea and really make something flow in a musical work, and also how not to repeat the same idea in the same exact way. And I learned from Daniel Asia at University of Arizona how to really get into my compositions. He kind of had a laser mind, and he could pinpoint things very quickly that need to be addressed. And so he taught me the importance of kind of being more intellectual in a way about the compositions. So Virko taught me, I would say, the emotion. Daniel Asia taught me the craft in a lot of ways, because I didn't really learn a lot of craft at UNLV when I went there. And not to say that I couldn't have, it's just that in my current state, when I was studying with Virko, I wasn't ready for him to teach me those things. Now I'm working with him, and we are actually doing a lecture series, which you can find on his channel, Virko Bali Official. I'll post a link when this live stream is over. But we're doing an interview series, and that's a little bit different. You'll see me in a different light, because I'm not trying to talk to him and like have a conversation. I'm not trying to argue with him, although that may change in future episodes. It's really an opportunity for him to talk about his experiences, his knowledge, and to share it without much interaction on my part. So sometimes I'll agree with him, sometimes I won't, but you won't really see that in the interviews. It'll mostly be me just guiding the conversation as I need to, and asking questions as I need to clarify anything he says. But it's not really reflective of my opinions necessarily. They're his opinions, and he really runs those interviews, even though I'm sitting there in kind of the interview chair. I don't really say much, but they could be interesting, especially if you're interested in Ukrainian music and how that came to be, and really the history of Ukraine, and also some aspects of music composition and how to be a better composer. So once I wrote the Elements of Music Composition, I said, okay, I kind of have a guide now, which is what I wanted. So I ended up creating that to be my own guide. It is really my theory of composing. And then that turned into the Technique Builder. But to give you an idea, so the third edition, the first edition was printed in 2008. Started working on it before that. The third edition was in 2021, and that was the first revision. I don't actually have the original third edition in my hand right now. I could probably find it, but so the third edition was probably about 2020, and this one was printed at the end of 2024. So it's my final version, and it is a guide that I'm using because I felt like I didn't have a guide. So the point here is that effective learning the one thing I had that was able to teach me everything so that I could go and teach in a university and teach music theory and ear training, I had a really strong internal motivation to learn how music was put together. And that led me through all kinds of different theories, Schenkerian analysis, counterpoint, tonal theory, atonal, 20th century theory, all these different subjects that we really have to know to be able to teach in university. And I learned that what composers need, because I was also teaching composition lessons, I've been doing that since 1998. What I learned was that when I keep visiting these composers, when I keep having lessons with composers, and I actually just had a lesson right before this, and the student said, I now understand why you're putting together these form courses and these audiation courses and this counterpoint course, because I was trying to explain to him, he wants to write a sonata, and I was trying to explain to him how sonata form works, but it's very difficult to talk about a development, much less talk about how you can be flexible in a modern sense with a development in your own composition. And he said, I finally understand why you're doing this, because there's this fundamental knowledge that composers really should know. And you can be a composer without this knowledge. But I think at a certain point, you hit a wall and your compositions reach a certain level and stay there until you learn how other composers before you put their music together. So that's why I've created all these courses, because they're really for my composition students. I initially created them because I kept teaching the same things over and over and over again in lessons. And I was wasting a good half hour of the lessons and doing it less efficiently than I could if I just created sort of a guided course that took them step by step that they could take in addition to composition lessons. And it saves time, it saves them money, and they, I think, have liked it so far. They found value in these courses. And I had another student who you're going to meet at some point tell me recently that what I'm doing is valuable. And so that's really what I'm going for, that, he's learned a lot and the courses are useful for actually taking care of the gaps in knowledge that composers have. So that's what I'm really striving for. The form and analysis course is now almost complete, to be honest. We're about halfway through and the structure is done, because what I'm really doing is I'm using the lectures from my university time when I taught form and analysis, but I am redoing them in a way that makes more sense for people that want practical application of these skills. So all this is to say that I think there's a natural transition. I think we go from a state where we kind of want to figure it out on our own, and then we eventually reach a plateau, and then we want to take the next step and we look for a guide. In my case, Arnold Schoenberg was really a guide for me. And the other composers that I studied with were also great guides. I learned techniques from them. But Arnold Schoenberg helped me conceptualize how all these different theories and techniques and subjects that we study as a composer can really be integrated. And so what I think is really important is we can take this foundational knowledge, is what I'm calling it, where we talk about all these different cornerstones, is what I call them in my elements book. Cornerstones are the big things, like counterpoint, orchestration, music theory. They're vast subjects that don't really relate to each other unless we take the time to figure out how they relate. How does counterpoint relate to theory? How does theory relate to orchestration? How does counterpoint relate to orchestration? These are important subjects, and they can kind of shape everything that comes after that. So the idea here is that if you learn this foundational knowledge quickly and early, I think that you're in a much better position to really be successful as a composer, as a musician. And that if I had one regret, I don't really have regrets, because my journey's been my journey, and I've really enjoyed the challenges and obstacles I've faced have been really sort of motivational for me, and I don't know that I'd be the person I am today without them. But if I were to give advice to a young composer, I would say compose, be creative, but spend time every day working on foundational knowledge. And that is the problem. What foundational knowledge? How do you do it? Right? So you can take my courses, right? But you don't have to. What I recommend is you start with ear training right away. Get that ear training going, because the ear takes the longest to develop. And I saw this time and time again in my courses at the university. When I would teach, I was never worried about the theory, because I knew if I had to, I could do crash course in theory and they'd learn it, right? But the ear training, that's something that just takes so much time. So start that ear training, do it at least 5 days a week, 6 if you can. I'm an advocate for taking a day off when you can. I think rest on the 7th day is fine. And then as soon as you can, start to study counterpoint, because counterpoint will help you learn how to write multiple independent lines, and it really does serve as a good precursor to music theory. Now, ear training, let's kind of put this in order. I'm going to be more methodical about this. I think you should start with ear training, and then while you're doing ear training, once you've learned to hear kind of the perfect fourth, the perfect fifth, maybe the major third, once you're there, I think you should start audiation training, because your audiation training can become so realistic. I was actually laying down last night and I closed my eyes and I was hearing, and this doesn't happen all the time, but I was hearing a clear orchestra version of a work that I had been working on. And it was down to the detail. And because my ear was at a really high level, I could pick apart the parts and I knew how to notate it if I wanted to. And because my musical memory has improved, I could remember it. Even now, I can still remember the orchestration and I can actually recall it now in really good quality. So audiation is one of those things you want to start very young too. I think the younger you start, the better, but don't let this discourage you. If you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you can still develop your ear and you can still develop audiation. And I think you should if you're serious about music or just want to get more out of it. So ear training, audiation as soon as possible after that. And then you can kind of spend some time, wait until you get some good audiation skills and you develop a pretty good ear. I would recommend the fifth, the fourth, the major, minor third, the major, minor sixth. Once you can do all that and you've got this audiation going, then you can do counterpoint. Now, I recommended those intervals because in counterpoint, those are going to be the constant intervals, the most important ones we're going to use. And when you do counterpoint, you need to make sure you're audiating. Always audiate your counterpoint solutions. Start with 2-part counterpoint. We're talking about species counterpoint. And I recommend strict style 16th century to begin with. Don't worry about 18th century right now, because we want to do stuff that's really easy to conceptualize. So you start with 2-part counterpoint, then you go to 3-part, 4-part. Then you can start to explore contrapuntal forms, which are not really forms in most cases, they're techniques. So, this is kind of the sequence I'd recommend. After counterpoint, then you can start studying music theory. Once you've learned music theory, and I think you just need to go through tonal theory and then really 20th century techniques, understand what serialism is made up of. Because when you understand tonal theory correctly, and then you understand 21st, 20th century theory, what you start to realize is that the techniques of serialism, even if you hate it, they're already present in tonal music. And so you can truly see this kind of beautiful connection between them. So once you've studied theory and you've gotten through the equivalent of an undergraduate program in music theory, then you can go on to form and analysis. From form and analysis, when you're learning form and analysis, you're still using audiation. When you're doing theory, you're still using audiation. You're always hearing everything that you see on the page. When you get into form, I believe in doing it from a composer's perspective, where you really hear things internally. You don't just learn what a period or a sentence structure is. You hear them. You make sure you always hear this stuff internally. From there, that really would be enough for most people. But if you really want to round out the system, take it to the next level, Schenkerian analysis, but not in the way that it is taught in most books. You want to learn about how we have this thread, this kind of line that ties everything together. And so you can study all this on your own. You can go to the library, you can find stuff on YouTube. Just make sure that you're always putting an audiation focus on it. And what I realized, and this is why I'm creating all these courses, the audiation course is done, but I'm going to eventually go through and redo it at some point. But I've created all these courses to allow students to go through this progression without having to do a lot of busy work. And here's where I'm coming from. If you were to spend an hour a day, up to 2 hours a day, really focusing on your foundational skills, then you could be done with all of this in 2 to 3 years. And then you'd have the rest of your life to go deeper and to understand. I mean, how many hours a day I don't know, genuine question, but how many hours a day do you spend looking for new ear training programs or music theory skills? Or how many hours a day do you spend trying to get a college degree in music? It's a lot of time. And some of you may be saying, well, I don't have the time. Even 1 hour a week in a methodical way is better than kind of this haphazard thing where you study a little bit here, you study a little bit there, you learn something here, you learn something there. Even if you can only find an hour or a couple hours a week where you sit down and start to develop these skills, you'll go slower, but the ear can still develop with one session a week of at least an hour. It'll be very slow, but it can still develop. Trust me, ask some of my college students who took my ear training courses. I know they didn't practice outside of our sessions, but their ears still got better. So the point is, you have to work where you are. And just to create these courses, when I was doing this as a full-time professor, I was working really late nights. And if you talk to anyone in my wing of the music department, they know that I was usually there before them and I usually left after them. I was there all day long working. And I had a baby, 2 years before my job was discontinued at the university, I actually had a baby. So I now have a 2-year-old. And what I would do is I would take the night shift and then I'd go and work so that my wife would be able to sleep because she needed it for recovery, and then take care of the baby all day long, which is a very difficult thing to do. If you've ever had a child, and the baby would wake up every 20 minutes and then sleep for the rest of the hour. And it was like that all night long. And then I'd go and I'd teach. But what I was doing is I was sort of multitasking sometimes and doing ear training, thinking about how it's going to get stuff done the next day. And so I understand being busy. When I was in college, I played in 6 ensembles, then I worked at Starbucks as many hours a week as I could. There were times when I was able to get 40 hours a week, but it was always dependent on the schedule. And I also sold books on the side, so I've always been very busy. But the thing is, you'll reach a point where once you have that foundational knowledge, it's with you forever. I remember some low times in my life when I was in Arizona and wondering kind of what I was doing. I remember thinking, yeah, but I'm in this master's program. And once I get that master's degree, nobody can ever take it away from me. So I'll have that, But I learned later that the degrees don't mean anything. What really matters is the knowledge that you get along the way, because it just makes music so much more fulfilling, right? So trying to motivate you a little bit. I don't know if it's working, but I'm trying to tell you that, if you are struggling at all to find the time to do these programs, if you can just carve out a couple hours a week and you can be methodical about it. So you start in your ear training, you get those intervals I talked about, perfect fifth through the minor six. My mirror exercise program goes through them in the right order. And then you start counterpoint. And so you're still doing a little bit of ear training. Maybe you can't do the flawless course where it's like 35 minutes a day, but maybe you can do one session a week, or better yet, 3 would be ideal. If you can get 3 sessions in a week, your ear will actually start to develop. And then once you get past the major minor six thing, then you add on counterpoint, and you cut out a few hours of your week for yourself, for your development, and don't do too much. It's more important, honestly, that you're playing music. If you're a musician or you're a composer, the priority always needs to be playing and writing music. The foundational stuff supports what you're doing as a musician, but it's not the most important thing, because you need to develop technical skill in composition and your instrument. But the way to make sure you're constantly developing and to improve your development, I'm just going to say this, if you were to just practice, you'll improve at one rate. If you were to just do ear training and do foundational studies and not practice an instrument or compose, then you'll develop at a certain rate, and they're kind of equal. If you do them together, I think it compounds it. And to throw a number out there, I think it's anywhere from 3 times to 5 times the effect. So you're getting a lot of value for really studying music in a comprehensive way. And that's one of the reasons why I'm working on this Staff Speak series. It starts with the basics because I want everybody to be able to learn music. And it's going to take you through all these subjects eventually in a very integrated, easy way, where you only need 10 minutes a day. With 10 minutes a day, you're going to get the ear training, the music theory, everything. And even though it starts simple, I think if you're one of those people that just can't find the time to do my larger courses, or to study counterpoint, I'm not trying to push my courses. I'm just saying they're obviously, they fit what I think you should do, the sequence that I think you should do, because you go with flawless, you go to my audiation course, masterclass, then you go to counterpoint, and then you go to form, and those are my courses in a nutshell. If you go through those, you'll get the right sequence, but they require a larger commitment. Flawless courses are anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes per lesson. Counterpoint is anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, at least 3 times a week. The audiation course is more like an hour a day. So it's a lot of time. So I understand not being able to do that. But if you start with the Staff Speaks, it's 10 minutes a day, even the lectures. And if you just can do 1 lecture a day, because they really work by compounding information, then eventually what will happen in 4 to 5 years, you will have gotten all that knowledge without having to sacrifice a huge part of your day. And so you may be thinking, 4 to 5 years, geez. But think of how much time just goes by. Think of how, it's April, and then all of a sudden it's May, and then it's June, and then it's 2026 and 2027. Think of how quickly time flies. And then imagine if you could just chip away every day, 10 minutes a day, and you gradually increase your knowledge until you have essentially everything that's in my larger courses, but you did it for 10 minutes a day, right? That's a goal with it. And it's going to be a massive series, because I said 50, but I was looking at it, and actually, I don't know where I got 50 from, because it's a 60 volume series. And it's going to take some time for you to get through. Just the first book alone that deals with the staff system takes 90 to 108 days. I think it's 108 days. So if you don't have time, I suggest you just casually go through the Staff Speaks. It's free here on YouTube, and just spend 10 minutes a day on it, right? And don't think too much about it, because you're going to take that course and you're going to say, I know this. I know all this information. Some of you will. Some of you will say this is new information. But it has the ability to challenge on multiple levels. So the beginning person will get to the ear training section and they'll say, okay, I can't identify these notes. You're not trying to identify the notes if you're a beginner. What you're trying to do in that course is you're trying to learn the names of the notes on the staff. If you're more advanced, then you're actually trying to identify the notes. When you hear a pitch, you're trying to say, okay, that's an E, that's a D, that's a C. So you can approach it at multiple different levels, and there will be a challenge for everyone. There's also things you probably haven't heard about, like inharmonicity and really where the staff system came from. So there's informational knowledge in there too. So I think everybody has the ability to learn from it. And with a 10-minute investment, that's not that big of a deal. So I don't really, you don't have to take my courses or anything like that. This isn't a push for that. But what I do think you should do is start something. Create your own program. Be your own guide like I was. Maybe you don't end up creating your own book, but you can definitely start somewhere. And you can say, okay, I have a framework now, because I've kind of given you a framework. And you can say, well, I don't really agree with that framework. My logic is you need an ear, because even though audiation is easier to develop, if you don't have an ear, you're going to audiate stuff and have no idea what's going on in your head. You're going to say, I don't know, is there 3 notes? Is there 2 notes? I hear the harmony, I hear a texture, but what is it? The ear training helps with that. So you want to start with the ear training, get a head start on that. Then you do the audiation. Then the audiation allows you to do counterpoint properly, where you're audiating multiple independent lines. And then music theory, where you're audiating chord progressions. And then formative analysis, where you're actually composing music and audiating entire lines. So that's where I'm from. That's where I'm coming from. The other thing that I took very seriously when I was younger, I used to run all the time. When I was in high school, I was an extremely fast runner. I had 1,500, and I believe it was 4 minutes and 8 seconds. That was the fastest I ever ran it. And I don't think I ever came close to that again, because my next fastest run was like 4.5 minutes. I don't remember, but I know it was in the 4:30s. And if I was trying to run an 800, I couldn't do it in less than 2.5 minutes. So one day, either somebody messed up on the time, although I don't think that's the case, or I just got faster as I ran. I had kind of like a perfect day. I ran really fast. And running had been a large part of my life up until the pandemic. And then strangely, when the pandemic hit, I actually stopped running, which you'd think, well, when the pandemic hit, you'd have more time. But teaching university, I had less time, because what happened was we suddenly had to move everything online. And I helped a lot of the other instructors. I had created a basic music theory course, which some of them ended up using online because it was already set up for that. And so I had to help them through that a little bit. And then others just needed some help creating their own courses. I actually got a grant from the university. It was a CARES grant to help other instructors set up their online courses. And so that ended up meaning that even though I wasn't traveling to the university anymore, I was spending more time, because what I quickly discovered, and anybody that creates YouTube videos understands this on some level, it is so much more difficult to teach online and to record yourself teaching than it is to show up in a classroom with a whiteboard, a projector, and a computer and teach in person. When you teach in person, you can be interactive, you can pass out handouts, you can throw something up on the projector, people can follow along. It's really so much easier, in my opinion, than teaching online. And so I ended up having actually less time, and I got out of running. But what I have learned is, truly, especially as I get older, if you don't have your health, nothing else really matters. So, it's important to prioritize that, especially if you're younger. Keep your health, don't do things that in 10 to 15 years you're going to regret. And that's just kind of my general advice on that. So I guess today I was really just interested in talking about growth, talk a little bit about kind of my own journey, give you some advice, give you a sequence that you can use to develop your own skills. And also, I was not looking at the chat today. So if anybody posted anything in the chat, I'll see if I can look at it, although YouTube's done something weird where you can't really see the chat anymore. I think there's a setting, I'm going to go look for it, where I can enable the live chat replay, and hopefully I can see any questions that were left. But you can also post a comment, and if you post a comment, I will definitely respond to you. Right now, the channel is not huge or anything, so I can definitely respond to everybody. So I think that, that's really what I wanted to talk about today. My advice to you is to look at where you're at, think about your schedule, try and figure out how much time you can spend, even if it's 1 day a week or 10 minutes a day, and figure out what you can do. And then create a plan of action so that you can achieve your goals, and just make it a part of your life. Obviously, things happen and you're going to have to move things around, but as much as you can, make it a part of your development if you want to be a musician. I think at some point I may talk about some additional techniques and things like that, but for today, I think we're going to leave it this. And I want to thank everybody for showing up, and everybody that leaves a comment or that likes this video. Thank you for doing that as well. And I will see you in the next session. Bye.